Now that we know that every element in an HTML file can be thought of as a box, let's further understand the box model by understanding two important CSS concepts known as margins and paddings. As we know that as soon as we write some text in an HTML file, first the text should be enclosed inside some container element, for example the paragraph element, and second that the paragraph element will create a box inside the browser and that box will contain the text. Let's begin our understanding of padding by applying a border of 1 pixel to the paragraph element and then giving it some light background color and foreground color to the text. Background color green, color of the text white, save it, and when seen in the browser, we see that the text inside the paragraph is not touching the paragraph's border. In fact, there is some space between the paragraph's outer edge and the text that it contains. This space between the content of an element and the element's border is called padding. It is important to keep in mind that every browser has its own CSS file and that file contains all the styles for all the HTML elements. And this is the reason that the paragraph element has padding applied to it by default. And the value of this padding is the value defined in the browser's default CSS file. And here we are learning a very important lesson. And that is, if we haven't set a property for an element inside our CSS file, do not assume that property's value to be 0 because it may have some non-zero value for it defined in the browser's default CSS file. Okay, let's change the value of padding to something big like 10 pixels and then see what changes it brings to its container. Save it and load into the browser. And here we go. We see that the space between the content and the container's edge has increased. This is what padding is all about. Creating space between the content and the container's edge. Then there's border. If we set the value of an element, say the paragraph, to be 200 pixels, and it has a 1 pixel border around it, the total width of the element would be 200 pixels plus the 2 pixels of border. That is a total width of 202 pixels. And if the width of our web page is, for example, 1000 pixels, we should keep in mind that the two elements of width 500 pixels each and having a border of 1 pixel will not fit in the container because their individual widths would be 502 pixel each and the total width would become 1004 pixels, resulting in the breaking of the page layout. And then there's the phenomenon of margins. Margin is the space between two elements. Suppose there are two paragraph elements, both sitting side by side, and suppose the width of our web page is 1000 pixels and the total width of first paragraph, including the borders, is 502 pixels, and the width of the second paragraph is 498 pixels, including the width of the border. If we do the math, we see that the width of the two paragraph elements add up to 1000 pixels. But even then, both the P elements will not fit side by side. This is because, by default, there is a space outside of an element as well, and that space is called margins. The default value of margin in the browser's CSS file is usually not 0, therefore we should not assume that it is 0 because this assumption would lead to breaking of the page layouts. Let's understand the example of margin using the span element. We are using the span element because for two elements to be side by side, they should be in line. If they are block level elements, they will always appear on a new line no matter what their width is. Although there is a CSS property that allows us to change the default behavior of a block level element and makes the block level elements appear side by side. But since we haven't studied that property, therefore we'll understand the margins using the inline span element. Let's create two span elements inside our HTML file and give the first span element an ID of span left and to the second span element an ID of span right. Span left, and let's give this the ID of span right. Now enter a descriptive text inside both the elements, left span and right span. Alright. Now inside our CSS file, let's define the properties of background color and padding for the left span element first. Bound span dash left, opening and closing curly brackets. Padding, the value of padding, let's say it's 5 pixels. Let's give the background color of blue. And for the right span element, let's set the same properties except the background color is set to green so that we can differentiate both the elements. And let's also change the text color of both the elements to white. Color colon white semicolon save. And when seen in the browser, we see that there is a space between the two elements, and this space is what is called margins. And now we can appreciate that we must consider the value of margin while calculating the total width of an element, because if we ignore it, there are bright chances that our page layout will break and the element that doesn't fit will begin on a new line. Before we wrap up this video, there is one more concept regarding margins and paddings that I want you to know. And that is, since the margins and paddings are on all four sides of an element, that is, top, right, bottom, and left, CSS allows us to set the margins and paddings for all the four sides individually with the help of the CSS properties known as margin left, margin right, margin top, and margin bottom. Similarly, the same holds true for the padding. Padding left, padding right, padding top, and padding bottom. Controlling the values of margins and paddings from all the four sides individually allows us even greater control over the elements of a page. Thanks for watching.